Well, as you probably guessed, we're going to talk a little bit about Miriam this morning. She was best known as Moses' sister, Aaron's sister as well. But did you know that Miriam herself is called a prophet? In fact, she's the first woman in the Bible to be named a prophet. And Miriam's name appears in more books of the Hebrew Bible than any other woman, more than Eve, more than Sarah, more than Rebecca. Miriam makes her way into the books of Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Chronicles, and then Micah. And Miriam's influence lasted well into the Christian New Testament times as well. All of the Marys in the New Testament, and there are 6 of them or maybe 7, depending on how you count them up. In the Greek, actually, it's a word Miriam. How do you measure the work of a prophet like Miriam? Is it by the number of prophecies that come true in the future? Well, that might contain a grain of truth, for the best prophets are those whose words have stood the test of time, and Miriam's words did stand the test of time. That little piece we read from Exodus 17, where it says she led her people in this song, it's widely recognized by biblical scholars to be one of the oldest passages in the entire Bible. So her words lasted a long time. Miriam wasn't flashy or showy, but she was much loved by her people. And I think God gave her as a gift to her people for more than just her words. In fact, Miriam actually kind of fades into the background so often you might not recognize that she is there. Now, there's a saying that says that life is best understood by looking back, but it can only be lived going forward. And I think if you, in the age to come, were to run across Moses or Aaron, or indeed any of the Israelites who walked through the Red Sea and wandered through the desert, and you were to ask them, they would tell you that Miriam was the presence that got them through living their lives forward. She helped them through the times of suffering, when times were confusing, and when times were difficult. She was faithful. She was always there. And the first place you see Miriam's steadfast presence is in the life of her younger brother, Moses. Moses' life began under a cloud with the attempted annihilation of the Hebrew people. Moses was destined to be the deliverer of his people, but he first of all needed to be delivered himself. And that deliverance was accomplished actually by 5 women, but one of them was Miriam. The baby Moses was born with a death sentence hanging over his head, as the Pharaoh of the day decreed that every baby boy born to the Hebrew people was to be drowned in the Nile River. And when Moses was born, his mother and his family kept him safe as long as he could, but when they could no longer hide the baby from the outside world, his mother made a huge gamble, and she fastened a little ark or a basket and put her beloved baby boy into it and placed it in the Nile. Incidentally, she was fulfilling the letter of the law, if not the spirit. This was a last resort, a Hail Mary, if you will, the action of a desperate family. For what chance does a little basket have of protecting a baby from the ravages of the mighty Nile River, a body of water that was so storied that the people of Egypt considered it one of their own deities? You may have heard that when people flee their homes, it's like the choice between staying in a burning building or jumping from it, hoping that you might survive. That's the choice before Moses' family. The chance of success of this little vessel carrying the baby out of danger is so slim as to be almost negligible, and yet it was the best of the bad choices before them. But it is while Moses was still in this little ark or basket that Miriam's faithful presence begins. She was not content to let her little brother out into the waters of the Nile alone in his little homemade boat. And so she decided that perhaps her presence, as little as it might prove to be, after all, could she really wrestle a crocodile or stop a storm that might capsize the little vessel or move quickly enough through rapids that would drown the infant inside to save him? but her presence might give him the best chance of survival. And so she follows the boat as far as she can. And against all odds, young as she is, a Hebrew in the land where Hebrews were slaves, a girl. After all, Pharaoh didn't even think girls worthy of destruction like the baby boys. That was one mistake that Pharaoh seemed to make. He often underestimated the women in the story. But Miriam's presence and resourcefulness does, in fact, deliver the infant Moses. She watches and waits until Moses is safely in the presence of an Egyptian woman who turns out to be the daughter of Pharaoh. And then Miriam, who I picture as wickedly smart and incredibly resourceful, comes out from where she's been watching the little vessel, and she offers the services of Jochebed, Moses' mother as well as Miriam's, as a wet nurse for him. So as great a leader and as great a man and as great as a spiritual leader as Moses ends up being, he was first of all delivered by the presence, quick wit, and boldness of his older sister Miriam. Miriam's faithful presence in the life of Moses ensures that he becomes the person and the leader he was destined to become. God knew what God was doing when God gave Moses the gift of his big sister. And after Moses was enfolded into Pharaoh's home, this is one of those places where Miriam fades into the background of the story. We don't actually know what it was like for her to grow up or what she did. It seems she never married or had any children of her own, and in her world, that was probably a deliberate choice on her part. I think she probably didn't give up on Moses at this point in the story. She'd already arranged to have her mother care for Moses in the home of Pharaoh throughout his childhood, so it's quite possible Miriam hung out there as much as she could as well. Her steadfast presence in his life was a constant reminder that although he was raised and educated as if he were an Egyptian, he truly was a Hebrew. And between Jochebed and Miriam, they instill enough in Moses of his lineage and his history. Perhaps they whispered to him the songs of his true people, so that he carried that in his heart for so many years in the Egyptian court. She remained in Moses' life, a guiding star for him, always present, ensuring that he found his way to what God had for him. But she wasn't only there for Moses. She was there for her entire people as well. When Moses grew up a little bit, he had to flee because he killed an Egyptian overseer to protect an Israelite. So he's absent for his people for 40 years, shepherding flocks. He got married, he had a family. But Miriam remained in Egypt with the people of Israel. Dr. Wilda Gaffney writes, when Moses was in hiding, building a new life with no intent of his own of returning to his people, and no inkling that God would call him and send him back, Miriam was the people's prophet, their only prophet. Whether Moses was 20 or even 30 when he fled, decades passed before his return to Pharaoh's court. Gaffney says, in my sanctified imagination, I see Miriam as the pastor of her people in Egyptian slavery. Her preaching and teaching reminded them that God was real and did hear their prayers. No matter how many generations it would take, God would deliver them. Miriam's presence was a balm for her people, even though they suffered. And that actually would make a lot of sense of the popularity and influence that she demonstrates in the years to come. That would make sense of why she's so fondly remembered, that the people continued to name children in her honor centuries later. But the next time Miriam turns up in this story is at that pivotal moment in the Exodus story when the people of Israel walk through the heart of the Red Sea. That's where we read, and the prophet Miriam, Aaron's sister, took a hand drum in her hand, and all the women went out after her with hand drums and dances. And Miriam sang to them all, sing to the Holy One, for he has triumphed victoriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. Who in the world would choose to bring a tambourine or a hand drum when they were running for their lives, carrying only the essentials? Who except for Miriam? She trusted in God's deliverance so much that she just knew she would have some occasion, and some occasion soon, to sing a song of praise to God. The prophet and pastor who reassured her people that God was real and would answer their cries when they were waiting for deliverance is the same one leading the people, urging them to lift their voices in praise for the way God saved them. Moses stands there holding the walls of the water on either side, and Miriam is breaking out her tambourine and leading the people in a song of deliverance, singing the praises of a God who delivered their people from nearly certain death. Faithful Miriam is with them through it all, and this time she's leading the way for the people to give thanks to God. Miriam, the worship leader. Now, of course, as most of us, Miriam was not perfect. Not everything she did was right. We read that strange little incident in Numbers when Miriam and Aaron challenged Moses' authority in a way that Moses didn't seem to appreciate very much. And she and Aaron are rebuked for what they have done. What precisely they are challenging Moses about is not very clear. It has something to do with his marriage, or possibly his divorce and abandonment of his first wife, Zipporah. Some have wondered if Miriam and Aaron were put off by Moses' wife's dark skin, but that's reading something into the text that isn't there. Some say that Moses has abandoned Zipporah and her children and then married another, because in Numbers 15 he shows up and it just inserts this little footnote into the story. He'd married a Cushite woman. But scholars differ over whether this is the same as the Midianite woman, Zipporah, he married earlier, or someone different. Perhaps, according to one midrash, which is a Jewish commentary on the text, Miriam, ever present and whose eyes rarely miss a trick, noticed that Moses' wife was not wearing her jewelry anymore. And so she asked this woman why she stopped wearing her jewelry. And this woman says to her, well, Moses is just so busy leading the Hebrew people, he no longer visits me as his wife. And so she didn't even bother to dress up for him anymore because he never came. So maybe Miriam was challenging his treatment of his current wife. I suppose they're all possible. None of them are certain. But whatever the reason for the challenge, shortly after that, Miriam was stricken with a mysterious illness. But in this story, as cryptic as the story is, you see how beloved Miriam was, both to the people and to her brothers and to Moses. The reason, perhaps, that she has such staying power and becomes known as the mother of the prophets. Aaron seems to interpret her illness as punishment for whatever they had done that had so vexed Moses that it earned a rebuke from God. And so he pleads with Moses to heal her. And Moses prays this beautiful prayer for his sister. Hear, Holy One, hear and heal her. And Miriam was healed. But still, as it becomes explicit later in the laws that are given, anyone with a kind of skin disease that Miriam had to be quarantined to ensure that their illness is not going to spread. So although she's healed, she has to spend 7 days away from the rest of the people in the camp. Now, you can't forget this entire episode takes place in the desert. And in the desert, the people of Israel would make camp, and they'd stay there for a while, and they would move on as they were led. And it seems that this occurs about the time when they should have been moving on somewhere. But just as Miriam had stayed with her people, pastoring them, leading them as a worship leader, giving them God's words, this time the people return the favor. They vote, as Dr. Wilda Gaffney puts it, with their feet on the banishment of Miriam. That is, they refuse to move them. Or they vote, she says, with their behinds. They sit on them. In verse 15, the Israelites refuse to continue on their journey without Miriam, and they wait for her, and God apparently waits for them. Or perhaps it is God who waits, refusing to venture forward without God's prophet Miriam. One measure of the strength of Miriam's prophetic tradition is illustrated in their refusal to leave Miriam behind after her affliction. The people sit with her. She is their prophet, and they are her people. And it is only after Miriam has finished her 7-day quarantine that the people get up and they move along. They have refused to go on without her. So Miriam's presence in the story is quiet. So quiet that it's not even remarked upon a lot of the time. And yet she's always turning up at these key points. Always there. She's always in the background. And although Moses is remarkable, he's a leader nearly without peril, a leader whom God speaks to face, or actually translated literally in Numbers 12:8, it's literally mouth to mouth. Moses is the one who prevailed in a showdown with the Pharaoh. He's the one who led his people through the heart of the Red Sea. He's the one who goes up the Mount Sinai and comes down with the 10 Commandments and the other laws that will shape the way this people live before God. But it often seems there's a bit of a separation between Moses and his people. After Moses spends a lot of time with God up at the top of Mount Sinai, he actually has to wear a veil over his face because the radiance he displayed after talking with God seemed to be disconcerting to everyone else. Moses is assuredly a human being, but he has this almost otherworldly ability to communicate with God. One might say that Moses was a larger-than-life figure. And the gap between Moses and his people, as he became closer and closer to God, that gap was filled by Miriam. Her presence with the people, her ability to stay with them and comfort them and listen to them and sing with them and praise with them and pray with them, that is part of what gets the people through. Now, Miriam finally passes away before Moses and Aaron, and the very next verse after Miriam passes away is this: "Now there was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Aaron and Moses." And this has caused the Jewish rabbis to believe that Miriam was as responsible for providing water as Moses and Aaron were as they wandered in the desert. Gaffney writes, "In the biblical text, her death is juxtaposed with the lack of water, which dried up when she died, nurturing the tradition that one of Miriam's prophetic gifts was the ability to provide water for her people." One might even say that she poured out her life for people, and so much so that they felt dry and parched when she died and they had to get along without her. So life can be understood by looking backward, but it can only be lived going forward. One of my very favorite writers always signs off a newsletter that he writes with this phrase: "I'm so grateful we can stumble through all this together." And that's the gift I see in Miriam, the mother of prophets. She walked, perhaps sometimes she stumbled, but she did that with her family, with her people, as they put one foot in front of the other in an attempt to follow God. Miriam was one of God's gifts to her people. So much so that a later prophet, Micah, includes her in a long litany of the many things God has done for God's people, writing, "I brought you out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses to lead you, and also Aaron and Miriam." She was not flashy, she was not showy. Sometimes we can't even see her in the story at all, until that is, she takes up her drum and she starts to sing. So if you've ever felt insignificant and wondered if you can do anything much at all in this world, if you've ever wondered if the things you do matter at all, I invite you to consider Miriam, who through her faithful presence just kept showing up. She helped deliver Moses so he could deliver his people. And then she walked with those people, living with them, leading them, providing for them, pointing them toward God, inspiring them to worship. The best kind of people to know in the world are the kind of people whose mark lives on after them through others, the kind of people who inspire you to want to live differently or better. And that is true of Miriam. If you take anything from Miriam's life, remember that her quiet presence, often left unremarked, was a gift to God's people. Would you bow with me in a word of prayer? Faithful God, sometimes life is confusing and hard as we have to live it forward through uncertain days and hard times and sometimes even suffering. We thank you for the people you have given us to accompany us on our journey. We thank you for those who remind us to say thank you to you and who lead us in worship, those people who might not be flashy but are always there, reminding us that you are with us too. Amen. As you go from this place, go to be a witness and a storyteller, looking for what God is doing and inviting others to join in. May you be blessed with opportunities and gifted with boldness to take them. And as you go, may God's grace attend you, may God's love surround you, and may the Holy Spirit keep you. Amen.